after being made our Guido.
Yeah. Especially.
You know, we know the truth. I know I'm innocent, Jerry knows he's innocent, we know each other are innocent. And that, to me, it was actually quite calming, because I thought, we're innocent, we're totally innocent. And we know that. Well, they're not going to show anything to implicate us, so I'm not, you know, I'm not concerned, if I'm honest.
We're certainly not scared. You know, if there is anything in the DNA results, and we don't know them, and we cannot know them, and I don't believe anyone in the press knows them either, but there is nothing in those DNA tests related to Kate and I that will show anything other than completely innocent. Whether that is enough to eliminate us, I don't know, but we will be eliminated. I'm confident of that because we have done nothing.
According to statement analyst Tania Cadogan, those words did not reveal an accident, but a claim that pointed towards something more serious. Cadogan notes that by saying, "I am being framed," Kate implied that evidence existed proving Madeleine was dead, and that such evidence had been placed to link her to that death. The analyst explains that the only evidence capable of framing Kate were the body fluids reportedly found in the hire car and in the apartment behind the sofa, along with the reactions of the blood and cadaver dogs. Cadogan adds that while cadaverine scent could come from any deceased person, body fluids are different. They can be tested, blood groups and DNA identified. In this case, 15 of 19 markers suggested the sample could have come from Madeleine, while 4 were too damaged to confirm. Although Portugal required a 15 of 15 match, Cadogan points out that these results did not exclude Madeleine as the donor. In the United Kingdom, she notes, such evidence would already be sufficient to warrant charges. When Kate said she was being framed, Cadogan interprets this as an admission that the evidence found in the apartment and the car did belong to Madeleine, and that at that time, Madeleine was in a condition that allowed samples to be taken and later found where they were. The question that follows in Cadogan's review is when those samples were obtained and by whom. Investigators brought in 2 British detection dogs trained to identify the odours of human blood and decomposition. The dogs, handled by Martin Grime, alerted inside the McCann's holiday apartment and again in the vehicle the family hired later in the investigation. Their reactions were treated as significant because the animals distinguished between residual blood scent and the scent of a deceased body. Analysts reviewing the case noted that cadaverine can originate from any human remains and cannot be tied by scent alone to a specific individual. The material traces that carried the scent therefore required laboratory testing to determine whether they could be linked to Madeleine. Forensic testing identified 19 genetic markers in one of the samples. 15 of those markers were consistent with Madeleine's known DNA profile, while 4 were too damaged to yield reliable results. The Portuguese authorities required a full 15 of 15 match for conclusive identification. Under that standard, the evidence remained technically inconclusive, yet the pattern did not exclude Madeleine as the donor. In Britain, a match of that strength would already have met the threshold for probable cause. The discovery of these partial DNA results, combined with the dog's alerts, became one of the central points of discussion. Analysts said the evidence appeared to support the suggestion that biological material from Madeleine had once been present both in the apartment and in the hire car. The interpretation of this evidence, however, led to disagreement and uncertainty. If the fluids truly came from Madeleine, questions followed about when they were deposited and by whom. The samples could have been collected shortly after the night she was reported missing, or they might have appeared at some later stage before the cadaver dog searches took place. The timeline presented practical problems. The family did not hire the vehicle until 25 days after the reported disappearance. If the samples had existed only within the first few days, analysts asked how those same traces could later be found in a car that had not yet been rented. Speculation arose around several possibilities. Some argued that police investigators might have planted the material to strengthen the case. others suggested that a member of the group who accompanied the McCanns in Portugal could have transferred it. There were even discussions within the wider family, as relatives of Jerry McCann were reported to have anticipated that formal charges might soon be brought against Kate McCann. Within this context, the analyst described a scenario in which the distribution of evidence could have served to implicate Kate more than anyone else. Traces reportedly appeared on items associated with her and with Madeleine, clothing, a toy, and surfaces inside the apartment, while nothing was said to have been found on Jerry McCann's clothing. The analyst suggested that, if arrests were made, such placement would direct attention primarily toward Kate. The possibility of deliberate placement raised logistical challenges. Any attempt to move or plant biological material in the hire car would have required access and would risk immediate detection. Investigators would normally examine who had rented the car previously and who had physical contact with it. No explanation was offered as to how such a transfer could occur without notice. Another question followed. If the Portuguese police truly possessed material linked to a deceased Madeleine, why did they never announce that her remains had been located? The analyst reasoned that, had the remains been discovered, the case could have been resolved within days, charges could have been brought, and the investigation into alleged abduction would have ended. Instead, millions of euros were spent on extended searches and private investigations that continue to pursue the theory of a living child. The lack of a definitive forensic conclusion left every interpretation open to challenge. Some saw the results as evidence of a cover-up, others as a failure of procedure and analysis. The only certainty was that the physical evidence, rather than clarifying events, deepened the mystery. Later discussions among independent profilers and commentators would return repeatedly to the same points. The dog alerts, the incomplete DNA match, the conflicting standards between Portugal and the United Kingdom, and the unresolved timing of when and how those traces first appeared. Together they formed the foundation of the continuing debate. A body of evidence that changed the direction of the investigation, but never settled what it truly meant. When Kate said she was being framed, her words implied that the evidence found in both the apartment and the hire car actually belonged to Madeleine. This interpretation suggested that, at that time, Madeleine was in a condition that allowed for biological samples to be taken and later located in those places. The uncertainty lay in when the samples were obtained. They could have been taken within a few days of her disappearance or at any time before the cadaver dogs were brought in. This raised a practical question. If the samples had been gathered early, how would anyone have known to plant them in the vehicle that would only be hired by the McCanns 25 days later? The scenario appeared difficult to reconcile with the timeline. Some observers speculated that the police might have planted the evidence to strengthen the case. Others considered that Jerry McCann or a member of the group known as the Tapa 7 could have been responsible. Even within the family, there were reports that Jerry's relatives expected that charges might eventually be filed against Kate. The suggestion was that such an action could have suited Jerry's interests. If incriminating traces appeared on Kate's clothing, on the child's red t-shirt, or on the soft toy known as Cuddle Cat, she could become the primary suspect while nothing linked to him directly. Should an arrest have occurred, she would have been the one implicated. The logistics of the theory presented more contradictions. If the samples had been taken early, how could they have been placed in the hire car without attracting attention? The first step for investigators would have been to trace who had rented the car previously and who had access to it. No record explained how such planting could take place unnoticed. Another inconsistency followed. If the purpose had been to frame Kate, why was there no public statement announcing that Madeleine's remains had been found? If the Portuguese authorities had truly possessed those remains, they could have declared the case solved, bringing swift closure and filing charges for death and concealment. The analyst noted that no such announcement ever came. The Portuguese police never confirmed the discovery of remains, and without that, the idea of framing appeared incomplete. If the body had been found and then hidden again after a few samples were collected, it would have made little sense. The case would have been resolved quickly rather than continuing for years. Instead, the investigation continued to pursue sightings and abduction theories, consuming significant time and resources. Under the framing theory, this prolonged pursuit stood in contrast to what would have happened if the evidence truly proved a death. The interpretation presented Kate's claim as contradictory. By saying she was being framed, she had acknowledged the existence of real evidence associated with her daughter's death, while simultaneously denying responsibility for it. The words placed her both inside and outside the circle of suspicion. In the broader narrative, the statement became a turning point. It connected the forensic findings with personal relationships, family expectations, and the unresolved question of motive. The contradictions within the framing theory mirrored the uncertainties of the evidence itself, evidence that, rather than clarifying events, continued to divide those studying the case. The forensic material linked to Madeleine was said to have been located in two distinct places: the holiday apartment and the hire car obtained by the McCanns 25 days later. In the end, the established facts were limited to these points. Samples containing partial genetic markers consistent with Madeleine were recovered from the apartment and from a vehicle rented weeks later. The cadaver dogs reacted in both locations, and no verified record explained how the same indicators appeared in each place. The time, method, and continuity of these discoveries were never resolved. In analyzing the statements and circumstances surrounding the case, the article described points of tension within the family and the reasoning that might have influenced certain actions after Madeleine's disappearance. The perspective was based on the words and behavior of Kate and Jerry McCann as they appeared during the investigation and in public remarks. The analyst observed that by claiming she was being framed, Kate indirectly acknowledged the presence of evidence indicating that Madeleine was deceased. This positioned her statement as both defensive and revealing, suggesting an internal conflict between denial and admission. The contradiction in her language led to broader questions about motive and response. The analysis presented a view that, if the death had been accidental, the subsequent actions may have been driven by fear of exposure rather than deliberate intent to deceive. It was stated that the concern extended beyond the immediate event to the potential consequences of an autopsy. The reasoning offered was that an autopsy could have revealed medical findings inconsistent with normal parental care, such as possible use of sedation or physical injury. The article described how such findings, if revealed publicly, could have resulted in professional, personal, and social consequences. Both Kate and Jerry McCann were doctors, and discovery of any irregularities could have meant the loss of their medical licenses, their employment, and custody of their remaining children. The fear of such outcomes was cited as a possible reason for any subsequent concealment or misrepresentation. The same interpretation linked these pressures to emotional and psychological strain. The analyst referred to the visible distress Kate displayed in public statements and the consistent effort by both parents to maintain the narrative of abduction. This was viewed as part of an ongoing struggle to reconcile the events with the image of responsible parenthood they sought to present. In this context, the actions described in the article were not presented as evidence of calculated deception, but as signs of panic and fear of irreversible consequences. The analyst suggested that the couple faced a conflict between moral truth and self-preservation, in which the need to protect family, reputation, and stability may have outweighed openness. The article also referenced reports of physical signs on Kate McCann during the investigation, noting visible bruising on her wrists and arms. These observations were included to illustrate family tension, but without definitive conclusions. No confirmed evidence linked those marks to any specific event. The document discussed that, in the analyst's view, Jerry's potential reaction to the situation might have differed from Kate's. He was described as pragmatic and focused on containment. It was suggested that if the events had indeed resulted in Madeleine's death, he may have believed that continued concealment would protect the twins and preserve what remained of their family life. The account proposed that Jerry's decision-making, as interpreted by the analyst, could have aimed at preventing further psychological harm to Kate and the children. It described him as having rationalized silence and the maintenance of the abduction narrative as acts of protection. The reasoning followed that, by avoiding admission, he sought to spare the family from social condemnation, legal jeopardy, and emotional collapse. This framework also explained the extended public posture maintained by the McCanns. Their continued appeals, media appearances, and the creation of a fund were interpreted as efforts to preserve an appearance of hope and purpose. The analyst described this as a coping mechanism rather than an attempt to deceive, a way of sustaining meaning under pressure. The article further noted that despite the strong public image, the family's private responses reflected ongoing strain. The analyst observed signs of fatigue, emotional distance, and controlled communication during interviews. These behavioral patterns were interpreted as indicators of psychological containment, the effort to keep a consistent story in the face of personal distress. The analysis connected this dynamic to the choice of language used in interviews and statements. The frequent use of plural pronouns such as we and us was interpreted as an attempt to distribute emotional responsibility. When discussing blame or public criticism, Kate used singular pronouns, I or me, whereas when addressing shared circumstances, she shifted to we. The analyst viewed this change as a reflection of unity in public defense combined with private isolation. The article described how this language pattern often appears when individuals share involvement or awareness of the same event. The plural form offers collective justification, while the singular conveys personal consequence. Through this linguistic pattern, the couple appeared aligned in maintaining a unified image but divided in emotional experience. The analyst's interpretation also extended to possible motivations behind their actions following the event. It was noted that fear of professional ruin, family fragmentation, and social condemnation could each contribute to silence. Such motives, the analysis argued, did not necessarily imply malice. They represented attempts to control loss and maintain coherence amid crisis. The article summarized that internal conflict, moral pressure, and emotional distress may have coexisted with the rational decision to sustain the abduction narrative. These elements, taken together, outlined a picture of self-protection shaped by fear and guilt rather than external coercion. In presenting this view, the analyst maintained a descriptive stance rather than accusatory. The focus was on the relationship between the evidence, the words spoken, and the psychological context in which they were said. It concluded that the case reflected not only forensic uncertainty, but also human contradiction between grief and denial, responsibility and preservation, and between truth and endurance. The relationship between the McCanns and the Portuguese authorities became strained as the investigation continued. The tone of communication between both sides shifted from cooperation to mutual distrust. Statements made in the press reflected differing priorities and growing frustration. The Portuguese police pursued lines of inquiry based on forensic findings and procedural expectations, while the McCanns maintained that their daughter had been abducted and criticized what they saw as unfair treatment. Both perspectives remained public, creating an atmosphere of tension that shaped the course of the investigation. Within this period, one statement gained particular attention. It was reported that Kate McCann had said, "Police don't want a murder in Portugal." Analysts treated the remark as significant because it appeared to imply knowledge of what had been discovered. The statement was interpreted as indicating that Kate believed the authorities were aware of evidence pointing to Madeleine's death but were reluctant to pursue it formally. The phrase was described as a moment in which private understanding became public. It reflected the frustration of being treated as a suspect while also acknowledging awareness of what the investigation might reveal. To some, it was an expression of emotional exhaustion. To others, it represented a recognition that the investigation had reached a point of confrontation between family and authorities. The article noted that the Portuguese investigators faced intense scrutiny from international media and political pressure to avoid accusations of mishandling. The scale of attention, combined with uncertainty in the forensic results, placed the police in a difficult position. Their caution in issuing definitive conclusions was interpreted by some observers as hesitation to acknowledge a murder case on national soil. The McCanns' public campaign for transparency and their use of media channels to defend themselves further deepened the divide. As the police maintained silence, the family's continued visibility in interviews and press briefings was viewed as an attempt to influence perception. This difference in approach created the appearance of opposition, one side restricted by procedure, the other asserting its narrative through open communication. The statement, "Police don't want a murder in Portugal," became a symbol of this conflict. It summarized the breakdown of trust between the investigators and the family. The police sought to manage an international case under pressure, while the McCanns, facing growing suspicion, perceived avoidance or concealment of findings. The article presented this situation not as accusation, but as an example of incompatible aims. The investigators required discretion. The parents demanded resolution. Between those positions, communication deteriorated, and each action by one side was interpreted as defiance by the other. As public attention continued, the investigation stalled. The forensic results remained inconclusive, the political climate became sensitive, and dialogue between the McCanns and Portuguese authorities all but ceased. What remained was a record of mistrust, a reflection of how pressure, exposure, and expectation turned cooperation into conflict. The article compared how specialists interpreted Kate McCann's wording when she addressed the investigation. Her statement, "I'm being framed," remained central to every analysis. Linguistic specialists reviewed that sentence not for emotion, but for structure, noting what it included and what it left unsaid. Tania Cadogan examined the phrasing and context. She pointed out that Kate did not deny the existence of evidence. She instead described herself as a target of manipulation. In Cadogan's view, this distinction was significant. By claiming to be framed, Kate accepted that evidence existed which indicated death, even as she denied involvement. Cadogan described this as the opposite of an accidental death statement, because an accident is ordinarily accompanied by an attempt to explain or justify what occurred. In Kate's case, the language expressed resistance rather than explanation. Cadogan's analysis separated two linguistic patterns, one associated with admission and one associated with defense. When individuals refer to accidents, they tend to describe cause, context, or remorse. When they speak of framing, they shift focus outward, assigning cause to an external force. She wrote that Kate's phrasing fit the latter pattern completely. The analyst identified no expressions of unintentional harm, remorse, or attempts to reconstruct an event. Instead, the phrasing created distance from responsibility while recognizing the existence of physical proof. For Cadogan, this linguistic choice aligned more closely with denial of accusation than with clarification of a mishap. Other commentators addressed the same phrase from procedural and evidential standpoints. Some pointed out that if the police had discovered indications of death, the possibility of accident would have been formally considered during investigation. However, The continued classification of the case as an abduction signaled that no verified cause of death had been established. The analyst noted that this procedural posture intensified public confusion, as both interpretations, murder and accident, coexisted in discussion without confirmation from authorities. Cadogan observed that the tension in Kate's language reflected awareness of evidence without acknowledgement of its implications. The statement neither rejected nor explained the forensic results, but reframed them as part of an external plot. She described the wording as an implicit admission that something irreversible had occurred. Within the document, this interpretation was contrasted with the perspective of those who considered accidental death possible. That argument held that panic, fear, and self-protection could lead to concealment after a sudden tragedy. Cadogan's reading did not fully align with that view because the linguistic patterns she identified lacked the features typically associated with accident narratives. The analysis also referred to the absence of modifiers that indicate loss of control. Phrases such as, "it was a mistake," or "it happened so quickly," none appeared in Kate's recorded statements. Instead, her expressions concentrated on being targeted, questioned, and misrepresented. This focus suggested confrontation rather than confession. The broader commentary linked these findings to the direction of the investigation. Once the statement, "I'm being framed," was public, analysts remarked that discussion shifted from possibility of accident to questions of deliberate concealment. The change did not arise from new physical evidence, but from interpretation of language. Kate's own words became the dividing line between the two hypotheses. The article described how investigators compared the pattern of her replies to known behavioral markers in interview situations. When asked about events, she often redirected the conversation toward police conduct and public perception. This redirection, according to analysts, was consistent with linguistic avoidance rather than narrative reconstruction. It indicated that the focus of her defense lay in contesting motive, not in clarifying sequence. Cadogan noted that such avoidance could not, by itself, determine guilt or innocence, but serve to classify the statement type. Within that classification, Kate's language fell consistently into the defensive category. The absence of accident-related descriptors and the presence of external attribution reinforced that conclusion. The report also mentioned that, in ordinary statement analysis, when a speaker truly believes an event to have been accidental, pronoun use often remains personal and immediate. I did. I was. It happened. When distancing occurs, pronouns shift outward or become passive. It was done. I was accused. Kate's recorded phrases followed the latter pattern. This linguistic evidence formed a consistent thread through the document. Every instance reviewed showed emphasis on external pressure rather than internal reflection. Cadogan summarized that while the public narrative focused on abduction, Kate's own language placed her in a different narrative, one of defense against implied culpability. The article then addressed the procedural implications of such wording. For investigators, a statement that denies accusation while acknowledging evidence requires corroboration through physical findings. In this case, the forensic inconsistencies prevented any definitive link. The language analysis could therefore describe orientation and attitude but could not define cause of death. Within that limit, the difference between accident and deliberate act remained unresolved. The linguistic indicators pointed away from accidental framing, yet the absence of confirmed evidence of violence prevented classification as murder. The conclusion recorded in the analysis was that wording alone could not establish either scenario, but demonstrated that Kate's perception of events was shaped by defense rather than confession. The report concluded that the phrase "I'm being framed" revealed the speaker's state of mind within the investigation, a belief that external forces controlled the narrative, that personal action was misunderstood, and that survival depended on maintaining that distinction. It remained, in analytical terms, the most revealing sentence of the case. If you found this breakdown insightful, do as well to subscribe, turn on notification, share for more deep dive investigations into the world's most mysterious cases. Comment your thoughts below. What do you think about Kate saying she's being framed?